Well, here it is, my review of the first 2 episodes of Star Trek Discovery. First off, I gotta be honest, from its inception, Star Trek has always pushed utopian notions of multiculturalism and diversity. Back in the 1960s, the inclusion of a black female officer on the bridge of the Enterprise, Uhura, was a very powerful and I think necessary statement at a time of racial divisions in America. I didn't really care that Benjamin Sisko was black by the time we got to Deep Space Nine. I just thought he was a great captain. There was even a character on that show who had changed gender a few times. I really didn't care all that much. The character was alien on a sci-fi show after all. And when Voyager gave us a female captain, I didn't care so much about the gender politics of it all because Janeway was a solid addition to the center seat. What's more, unlike modern SJW depictions of strong female characters, Janeway's success as a female leader was not made possible by denigrating the male characters on the show. She stood on her own merits. Well, thanks to third-wave feminism, nowadays, strong depictions of masculinity tend to be pretty rare. Just look at Doctor Who. The amount of blatant misandry the BBC has infused in that show over the past few years has been disgraceful. I covered this in a previous video, but I didn't even mention the fact that it got worse in Peter Capaldi's 3rd year. Well, Star Trek Discovery is a product of not only the current progressive leftist Hollywood zeitgeist, but very much a product of its own long-standing obsession with identity politics. I've been a fan since I was 4 years old, and I can honestly say that in all previous incarnations, the show's focus on race was always fairly low level. It wasn't something that detracted from the quality of the stories. Well, put simply, Star Trek Discovery has taken it way too far. Before I explain why and give you my thoughts on the first 2 episodes, I have to explain the wider political context that the entertainment industry has fallen prey to. Whether it's the Oscars or the Emmys, we know where Hollywood writers and actors stand politically nowadays. It's an elitist liberal bubble that's completely disconnected from the thinking and concerns of everyday Americans. They're all anti-Trump, pro-globalism, open borders, pro-feminism, and every other progressive talking point you can think of. Star Trek was, in many ways, rife for an SJW takeover, unfortunately, given how it was always fairly left-leaning in its politics to begin with. It's just that it was always fairly tolerable until now. When J.J. Abrams was casting Star Wars The Force Awakens, and remember, he was heavily involved in the rebooted Star Trek prequel movies, he said the following about making the cast of that film more racially diverse. We wrote these characters, but when we went to cast it, one of the things I had felt, having been to the Emmys a couple of times, you look around that room and you see the whitest fucking room in the history of time. It's just unbelievably white. And I just thought, we're casting this show and we have an opportunity to do anything we want. Why not cast the show with actors of color? Like, not for sure, and if we can't find the actors who are great, we shouldn't, but why don't we make that effort because it wasn't written that way, and isn't that the cooler version of doing this, as opposed to saying this is an urban show? It fucking kills me when they call something an urban movie like it's a separate thing, like it's that thing over there. In other words, the fact that America is a majority white country seems to be a bad thing in the eyes of Hollywood progressives. But apparently, this isn't racism or anything. Star Trek Discovery is the first Star Trek show to take this obsession with racial diversity to such a degree so as to be full-blown anti-white, and I'm really not exaggerating. This is coming from the writers and the cast. They openly admit to this, and I'm going to get to their statements in a moment. So, let's get into the first 2 episodes, The Vulcan Hello and The Battle at the Binary Stars. The show departs from the usual trend of having the captain as the main character. This time, it's the show's first officer, Michael Burnham. Yeah, a woman named Michael. It's weird she has a dude's name, but it's probably because they're trying to be edgy about gender or some other lefty bullshit. Look, it's not a major problem. We had the character of Jane Cobb on Firefly. He was a great character. That was a fantastic show. But Michael for a woman? Michael? The first episode opens with a weird-ass looking alien shouting to his people about how the Federation are beginning to encircle their territory and how that's not okay. Oh, by the way, this alien is, he's a Klingon. And this is what Klingons look like now? Fucking unbelievable. They literally bastardize everything about Star Trek on this show. And yes, I know Klingon makeup changed a couple of times in the franchise over the years, but seriously, this is just insulting to the fans, and it was totally unnecessary. I'm sorry, these aren't Klingons. Just fuck off. Oh, by the way, they speak in Klingon all the frickin' time. All the time. Now, previously, when Klingon spoke in Klingon, it was used pretty sparingly. As a convention of film and television, when a character is speaking in their native language, in their language other than English, for a moment, they introduce the audience to the fact that a character is not speaking English, and then begin speaking English. This was done several times to good effect in Star Trek VI. They're actually still speaking their own language, it's just that it's easier for the viewer if they hear English. Audiences understand this convention of TV and film. The writers and producers of Star Trek Discovery clearly don't. You have to read whole chunks of English subtitles for entire scenes. And Klingon is just awful to listen to long term. The Klingon scenes are a real chore to get through on this show. I gave thought to turning it off several times, I was that bored. After that, the character of Michael Burnham and her captain, played by Michelle Yeoh, are seen on a desert planet because you need to throw in an alien landscape to make the trailer look more epic. And I say that without cynicism. This scene perfectly encapsulates the show and everything that's wrong with it. It's pointless, goes on too long, and doesn't serve the plot in any way, shape, or form. It's an empty teaser that has nothing to do with the story. They're lost on a planet. They speak a bunch of dialogue about stuff that isn't relevant to the story, that you won't remember, and the captain has them make the shape of the Federation insignia with their footprints in the sand so that the ship can find them and beam them up. Then we have the god-awful opening credits that look like they were produced by someone who just completed a week-long After Effects course. The ship is the Shenzhou and not the Discovery. In a somewhat peculiar departure, the Discovery doesn't appear in the first 2 episodes of the show. So bizarre. Imagine Voyager not appearing in Caretaker, Deep Space Nine not appearing in Emissary, Enterprise not appearing in Broken Bow, or the Enterprise D not appearing in Encounter at Farpoint. It's just kind of odd. It's not a big problem. Anyway, I'm going to fast forward here a bit. The Shenzhou encounters some object that they can't identify, and Burnham investigates. I shit you not, at one point they try and look at this thing using an old school telescope. Anyway, long story short, it's the Klingons. They're led by a character called T'Kuvma, who is determined to unite the 24 houses of the Empire against the Federation. He's concerned that the Federation will destroy the individuality of Klingon culture. So you can see what's happening. Star Trek has always made use of allegory in its political messaging. This time is no different, except that modern progressive anti-Trump Hollywood is in charge. You see, the Klingons represent, wait for it, and I'm not making this up. If you haven't seen this, you won't believe what I'm about to say. But it's true, okay? And I have evidence of this. The Klingons represent white nationalists. I'm not making this up. This is from the producers themselves. Now, the left believes Trump is a white nationalist, and he isn't. He may have white nationalist supporters, but you can't control your audience. I mean, it's not like Obama had Black Lives Matter support. Oh, wait, he did. He did have Black Lives Matter supporters, and he supported them. That's weird. Anyway, the Klingons are concerned with the Federation's multicultural philosophy, and are rightly concerned that they'll be ethnically cleansed by the encroachment of the United Federation of Planets. They wish to remain Klingon, which is their rallying cry. Seems reasonable enough. The writers use this slogan, Remain Klingon, as a stand-in for Trump's slogan, Make America Great Again. This is true. Aaron Haberts, a co-executive producer on the show, told the outlet that Donald Trump's candidacy was front and center in our minds when they started putting the series together in 2015. Haberts said one of the antagonist groups on Star Trek Discovery is an extremist Klingon sect whose rallying cry, Remain Klingon, the show made intentionally similar to Trump's Make America Great Again slogan. It's a call to isolationism, Haberts said of the slogan. What's wrong with that? It's about racial purity. It's about wanting to take care of yourself. What's wrong with wanting to take care of yourself? And if anybody is reaching a hand out to help you, it's about smacking it away. That was pretty provocative for us, he continued. And it wasn't necessarily something that we wanted to completely lean into, but it was happening. We were hearing the stories. In other words, a race of aliens in the future are not allowed to live in isolation if they choose to. They should be shamed for wishing to remain true to their own culture. They're concerned by the encroachment of the Federation and how it might dilute that culture and identity, so the Federation has more in common with the Borg in this show because of its intolerance for actual culture and racial diversity. You will be assimilated. If you want to maintain true diversity, it's best to let people live the way they wish. The Federation is attempting to expand into Klingon space, and the Klingons wish to have nothing to do with them. They have the right to have nothing to do with the Federation if they wish. So I ask you, who exactly are the bad guys in this story? Because I think the Klingons have a right to live in isolation if they wish, and the Federation sound like the imperialists here. Here's something worth considering. When the trailers were released, many people claimed that Star Trek Discovery was promoting white genocide because very few white people featured in the cast. But I actually don't think that that's the only reason that such an accusation could be leveled at this show. Because if the Klingons, who are actually very black in this show, if the Klingons are a metaphor for white people who voted for Trump, many of whom would have had to have also voted for Obama twice, given the sheer number of people who voted for Trump, then it could be argued that Discovery is promoting white genocide by claiming that preserving one's racial and cultural heritage is a bad thing, which is what the Klingons want to do. You never hear leftists complaining about how Japan is 98-point-something% Japanese. They're never shamed into opening their borders to multiculturalism. It's just Europe, America, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. It's interesting, isn't it? The attitude of the Federation sounds quite a bit like the EU, demanding that Poland open its borders to migrants. But Poland wishes to preserve its identity, so it's maintained its Judeo-Christian culture by refusing. Of course, the showrunners and indeed the cast believe this is obviously wrong. Star Trek Discovery star mocks angered fans as closeted humans after Trump rants. One of the stars of Star Trek Discovery has promoted the show's premiere week by calling pro-Trump viewers trolls and closeted humans. British actor Jason Isaacs plays Captain Gabriel Lorca on CBS' latest installment of the Star Trek franchise, but his political activism had him arguing with potential fans since its September 24th broadcast. Trekkies, who protested when he called President Trump Little Hand Man, and voiced support for national anthem protests were mocked and ridiculed. The national anthem protests they're referring to there are the fact that he supports the take a knee bullshit. Keep wanting to engage trolls, but click their profiles to see endless white nationalist hate spew. Maybe they follow me as closeted humans, Mr. Isaacs wrote Tuesday. Please feel free to binge the finest hours of Hollywood's illiberals for fun. A Chuck Norris Kid Rock marathon, anyone? Lobotomy? The actor's message came after 3 days of anti-Trump insults. He claimed the White House is run exclusively by straight white males, because obviously for the left, being straight, white and male is a problem apparently, and said Mr. Trump suffers from infantile sewage flowing from his rectum of a mouth. So you decide to interject and insult half your fan base. That was something that someone said to him on Twitter. Always enjoyed your acting, just to find out you were another hashtag Hollywood liberal. Other articles have focused on shaming fans for not liking the show. Now, I find this particularly detestable. As is always the case with the regressive left's mudslinging tactics, if you don't agree with their politics, you must be a white nationalist or a fascist or a hateful, bigoted, racist, alt-right Nazi troll or something. Star Trek fans' anger at remake's diversity proves they don't understand Star Trek. Racists and sexists hate on Star Trek Discovery's diversity, even though it's still unbalanced in their favor. So much wrong with this headline, from the Mary Sue no less. Firstly, there's quite a bit I find wrong with the fact that the show is obviously virtue signaling by casting a female captain and first officer for the first 2 episodes. Now, this is not permanent. Spoiler alert, as if you need another spoiler alert, Michelle Yeoh's character is killed by a Klingon in the 2nd episode before Isaacs will take over as captain of the Discovery later in the series. But nevertheless, this is more than a little overboard. But hey, the future is female, right? Female Doctor Who, make Iron Man a black woman. The entire bridge crew has only one white male that I can detect. The only other somewhat prominent white male character is an admiral who, wouldn't you know it, is a hard ass who passes a racist remark to Burnham. Yeah. It's the 23rd century, folks. Human beings have gotten past petty racism since before Archer's time in Enterprise 100 years before. But racism is back on the agenda in Star Trek now. Because we live in 2017 and progressives see racism everywhere, especially where it doesn't exist. That's why anti-white sentiment is rife in social justice-infested college campuses and racial segregation is being called for under the guise of inclusion. The worst recent example, of course, was Evergreen College. I have to be honest, I hate the fact that I'm having to discuss this show like this, in these terms of race and diversity and the lack of white people, particularly white men. It's a toxic conversation. I would much rather focus on the characters and the story. To be fair, there's not much of either here. But the show is forcing me to do this because this is what the showrunners wanted. This is what they're prioritizing. The left is obsessed with identity politics, and when it's on obvious cringe-inducing display, it should be called out. They're openly admitting that they're against conservatives and the politics of people who voted for Donald Trump. They obviously support open borders, the irony being that the Federation has borders. But then again, I don't expect these hack Hollywood writers to understand the history of the franchise that they're being given to work on. There's basically no real story to discuss here in the first 2 episodes. There's a conflict between the first officer and captain as to how best to proceed against the Klingons. Burnham has numerous flashbacks to her Vulcan upbringing with Sarek, which are not particularly interesting. She gets locked up in the brig because she's a hothead who doesn't respect the chain of command at all. She's very off-putting as a character. I just couldn't root for her. Of course, leftists will say, why, because she's a black woman? No, because she's fucking obnoxious. The Klingons attack, there's a battle with a Federation armada, then Burnham laughably escapes from the brig because apparently on this ship, you can get the computer to lower the force field if you plead to it that you're really scared of dying. It's comfortably the dumbest thing I've seen in Star Trek since the last Star Trek XXX motorbike movie where the crew of the Enterprise defeat the bad guy's spaceship swarm with rock music. Anyway, Burnham gets locked up for mutiny, and the show ends in the usual Netflixy ongoing cliffhanger fashion where none of the individual episodes really stand on their own merits. There's nothing else of value to really comment on here. I know many people may say how I'm being overly critical and that previous Star Trek pilots weren't always up to much. But even the lackluster and rather boring encounter at Farpoint of the Next Generation had redeemable qualities to it. It had humor, levity, an endearing warmth, a thought-provoking plot, decent characters, with the exception of Wesley. I couldn't believe how one-dimensional the Discovery characters were. This Burnham chick has 2 gears, intense brooding and semi-constipated judgmental angry mode. Also, the actress is really unsuited to this role. I don't like her performance at all. There's no camaraderie between the characters, nothing relatable about them, no relationships to become invested in. The show is written so poorly, the actors just rattle off dialogue in a really fast-paced manner as to just get through the scenes and get them over and done with. Nobody speaks like this in the real world. It's not believable. It's also one-dimensional, wooden, and forced. They're like robots. There's nothing hopeful, thought-provoking, or optimistic or intelligent about this plot. We've seen all of this kind of stuff before. It's just a series of action scenes and haphazardly written exposition dialogue that just feels rushed. The whole affair feels joyless, and that's really the best way I can describe it. SJW content tends to be preachy and self-righteous anyway. Everything is problematic to an SJW, and jokes are offensive. So I guess that's why the entire affair is so painful. There's no humor, no color or depth. I literally had a bad taste in my mouth after watching these 2 episodes. It's not Star Trek. It's a subpar sci-fi show that pisses over the legacy of the franchise. It makes use of Star Trek iconography, terms, jargon, place names, and sound effects. It's a leftist propaganda project masquerading as your once beloved TV series. As for the other elements of the production, well, the cinematography is in keeping with the J.J. Abrams reboots, plenty of lens flare to annoy you throughout. The only positive I can make is that the CGI, the special effects, are extremely good. That's it. Superficial technical compliments are all I can level at this series. We didn't need another Star Trek show. There's been 28 seasons of live-action Star Trek, 10 movies, and 3 other Star Wars films that were branded as Star Trek. What more could a fan want? But if we were going to get a new show, this was not exactly what the fans would have wanted, is it? I personally would have liked to have seen what happens after the events of Voyager and Nemesis and follow on in that timeline. But we keep getting prequels whether we like it or not. Prequels that feel extremely divorced from the rest of the franchise. And yeah, Enterprise was very poor when it began. It did improve in the 3rd and 4th seasons, and that was too little too late, but I think Discovery is even less watchable than Enterprise, so it's pretty bad. Fans called for a Captain Riker series at one point, and as we know, the fan films were getting so good that Paramount CBS decided to introduce restrictive fan film guidelines to make it almost impossible to make them. So the reality is, it's clear now why Axanar had to be stopped. Star Trek Discovery looks to be about the Klingon Wars, which Axanar was focusing on, and this would have been a conflict. I strongly recommend you check out the Prelude to Axanar fan film. It's way better than Discovery. It's made by fans who love the franchise, and there's no leftist racial identity politics bullshit to deal with. I don't know why Paramount didn't just license Axanar and have fans produce it. Yes, there were question marks about where the crowdfunding was going. I get that, and I can sympathize with Paramount's position with respect to copyright infringement, but something could have been worked out because the interest by the fans was so enormous and Paramount just ignored it. People wanted Axanar to happen. They could have just agreed a revenue split. It would have been win-win for everybody. But instead, they hired the same team of Hollywood producers and writers who produce and write pretty much every other generic, safe, formulaic TV series and movie right now. And the results are this boring, unwatchable abomination that is Star Trek Discovery.